A review of Chapter 22. The title of Chapter 22 is Descent with Modification, a Darwinian View of Life. This chapter begins a series of chapters that we will cover on evolutionary biology. This one kind of starts off with a little bit of history. Charles Darwin and some of the ideas before Darwin and some of the ideas during Darwin's time. Now, Charles Darwin in 1859 published the book Origin of Species. Now, in this book, he made two major points. One point was that evolution happens, and the second point was that it happens by means of natural selection. Now, there are some areas, the first section of the chapter discusses some pre-Darwinian views. Go through my notes on this, read through these sections here in the first part of Chapter 22 on this. Pay particular attention to the names that I've mentioned in the notes. For example, Aristotle. Aristotle in ancient Greece believed in fixed species, but he also believed in what was called scala naturae, a natural scale. That is, not only were species fixed, but you could line them up in a sequential ladder of perfection or complexity or progress. I mentioned people who came later, like Cuvier. Cuvier studied paleontology. He is associated with the concept of catastrophism. That is, he explained the differences in the fossils by means of catastrophes that happened in the past in that particular location. Linnaeus, the father of taxonomy, also believed in fixed species. In my notes, I mentioned Archbishop Usher in 1650. He was the one that proposed that the earth was young based on his interpretations of the Bible. But some of the geologists believed in gradualism, starting with James Hutton. He believed that gradual changes in the processes of the earth, erosion, uplift, whatever, add up over time, giving us major geologic structures like canyons and mountains. Charles Lyell followed his work and developed the idea of uniformitarianism in geology. That is, the present is the key to the past. The stuff that's going on now also went on then, and that given enough time and conditions, the effects accumulate to produce what we see today. Now, Darwin was not the first to propose a mechanism for evolution. The year Darwin was born, Lamarck came up with proposed a mechanism for evolutionary change. His mechanism was called acquired characteristics. Now, in 1809, this was long before Mendel, nobody knew anything about genes. He believed that you would acquire a trait, or an organism would acquire a trait during its lifetime and then pass it on to the next generation. He thought that's how giraffes got long necks. Now, the problem with that, as we know now, is we don't pass on acquired traits, we pass on genes. It would be like getting a tattoo and then your kids would be born with tattoos. It doesn't work that way. The next section in our notes talk about Charles Darwin. Now, after he graduated from college, he got a job on the HMS Beagle, a ship. Figure 22.5 shows the voyage of the Beagle. The voyage of the Beagle was to chart the South American coastline and the Galapagos Islands. His job was to tag along as ship's naturalist and collect and identify everything. Well, he noticed particular peculiarities in terms of how species were suited or adapted to their particular location, especially in terms of the Galapagos Islands. Now, by the 1840s, he already had his ideas of natural selection. And he probably would have delayed publishing it if it weren't for a guy named Wallace, who in 1858 came up with a natural selection idea as well. He sent the letter to Darwin. Apparently that lit a fire on him, so he published his book in 1859. Now, Roman numeral 3 of our notes talks about the concepts of the Darwinian model. One is the idea of common descent. So he used the phrase descent with modification. He perceived that living things were related to each other through a common ancestor. So he didn't look at life as a ladder of progress or a ladder of perfection, but as a branching bush, such as what I have over here. So this would represent an evolutionary tree where we have the organisms then, the organisms now. That is, organism A and B are related through common ancestor F. Now, A did not evolve from B, but A and B came from another common ancestor, which was neither A nor B. Likewise, A, B, and C would come from common ancestor G, and all of these would come from common ancestor K. That is the Darwinian model and is the model of evolutionary biology today, not the ladder of progress model. This was a major departure from Scala Naturae. This was even a difference in departure from Lamarck. Now, he also perceived that natural selection is the cause of adaptive change. Now, he already knew that selective breeding, artificial selection, can produce all kinds of strains and varieties of domestic pigeons and flowers and livestock and crops. He figured if people had the ability to do that through selective breeding, that nature would also have this ability, even more so given the right time and conditions. So he appealed to artificial selection as an example of natural selection. Now, in the notes, I wrote down the principles of natural selection. Number one, all species show variation. That variation is inherited, or what we call now as genetic diversity. Number two, in nature, more offspring are produced than can survive because resources are limited. Number three, because of number two, there's a struggle for existence between individuals. And number four, some individuals just happen to have an advantage because they have certain traits that make them more suited to whatever that situation is. Those individuals are going to be more likely to survive, but more importantly, they're going to have greater reproductive success. They're going to have more offspring than those that are less suited. So it's not about survival of the fittest, it's about survival and reproduction of the fittest. What doesn't make it to the next generation doesn't count. So number five, the result is natural selection, which allows for a population to change over time to adapt to whatever situation there is. So another concept of the Darwinian model is that it's not the individual that evolves. All the individual does is survive and reproduce, or not, as the case may be. It is the population that can change over time. Again, a major departure from Lamarck. With Lamarck, it was all about the individual. Here, it's about the population. Now, this has been noted in such cases as antibiotic resistance by bacteria, such as MRSA, pesticide resistance by certain insect pests, evolving or adapting to the use of these measures to keep them under control. So natural selection is a reality in terms of adaptive change. Now, under Roman numeral 4, I wrote in the notes other evidences in support of evolution, or better yet, other evidences used in evolutionary biology. Now, this thing I have here on the board is actually called a phylogenetic tree. Now, the phrase phylogenetics or phylogenetic tree actually comes up in a later chapter, but I like to talk about it first here. A phylogeny is simply the ways that things are related. A phylogenetic tree is a graphical drawing of the proposed evolutionary relationships between organisms based on available information. So this section of this chapter talks about where does this available information come from. Well, I discuss a few of these in the notes. Biogeography, a study of what lives where and why. So biogeography, especially of oceanic islands, of continents, you have particular species that live there and nowhere else. But the species that are more similar tend to be geographically closer. So that's a biogeographic trend that Darwin noticed. I mentioned the fossil record. Didn't talk too much about the fossil record, but fossils are used. Comparative anatomy is used. Now there's a diagram on figure 22.17 showing forelimbs of 4 vertebrates. Now, a homologous structure is a structure that organisms have because their common ancestor had it. Whether that's used the same or not doesn't matter. So, for example, the upper arm bone is called the humerus bone. So the humerus bone of a cat is considered homologous to the humerus bone of a whale or a humerus bone of a bat. So, because it's presumed that the ancestor of the cat, the whale, and the bat had a humerus bone. Now, birds are also vertebrates, and they didn't show a bird's wing in this diagram, but the bird's wing and a bat's wing are not considered homologous as wings. They are considered homologous as forelimbs, but the bone structure of the wing of a bat is different from that of a bird, indicating that as wings, they functionally evolved independently. So not everything is homologous. Some things are analogous too. comparative embryology is used. The concept of comparative embryology is that closely related organisms have similar embryonic or larval stages. That's basically it. And more recently, molecular biology. Closely related organisms are going to be more similar on the molecular level, is the presumption here. So with today's technology, we can compare DNA sequences, protein sequences, RNA sequences to infer relationships, as well as with fossils and biogeography and everything else. So if you can reconstruct a phylogenetic tree, not just with one line of data, but with as many as you can get, then you have a lot of data to support this tree. You have power in this proposal. And that's the idea of reconstructing a phylogenetic tree. And that finishes chapter 22.